Ooh, hello my friends. Today we're back in action with the next addition to the Kitbashed Swamperial Guard army, and we're going to be whipping up another of our weaponized swamp creature hybrids. So let's do it.
Swamp Rip Miniatures.
Now, in my last video, I introduced the idea of subclans as a way to bring a bit more variety into the overall army build, and one subclan that I delved into previously, kinda by accident, is a group of green boys that tame and weaponize swamp creatures for use in their mechanized forces. We've already built the mollusk bombast cannon, the arachnorus, and this little prototype squig rough rider that never turned into a full unit, but this time we'll be combining a spooky old marshcrawla sloggoth with these leftover malleus rocket launcher parts to create another mobile field ordnance battery. The first change I wanted to make to this bad boy was removing the wooden lip here, as I wanted the firing platform to be open at the front and a bit more bulked up at the back. So with that in mind, I trimmed away some of the other little details on the floor, which allowed me to transplant the wooden wall piece using some green stuff to fill in the gaps. I added a bit of a scratchy wood grain texture to the green stuff to try and blend the two sections together, and with that, the build was officially underway. I've used parts from the Snotling pump wagon in 2 out of 3 of my field ordnance batteries so far, and I wanted to increase that to a 75% usage rate today by building up a platform for the rocket pods using this half of a barrel wheel thing as well as the wooden board from the roof. This allowed me to attach the pods at an elevated position so the rockets wouldn't remove any green boy ears as they fly out, and I also added the original blast shield thing to inject a bit more sort of Imperial Guardness into the mix, following it up with some more wooden pieces from the pump wagon and sloggoth kit to finish off the main firing platform. It didn't take too much work to get it to this point really, but I was liking how it was all looking so far, so I decided to add the miniatures next to get a sense of where I'd need to add the final details. I went for 3 of our green boys on this build as there's not a great deal of space up top in the firing platform, and you definitely know the deal with these guys by now. We're just using our same odd combination of Gretchen, Snotling and Imperial Guard pieces with some of my homegrown green stuff molds thrown in for good measure. So I won't dwell here for too long. Check out some of the previous videos if you want to see how these guys are made in more detail. For this build, I decided to glue the green boys down into place before I painted them. Usually I'll paint them individually and then add them, but I wanted to test this out to see if it could make the painting process a bit more streamlined in the future, as we still have a lot of units to add to this army, and spoiler alert, it really didn't, but we'll talk about that in a moment. For now, I've just got a few little finishing touches to add. The first of these was relocating the little ramshackle ladder I'd removed earlier to make way for the platform, and I followed that up by shoving a random autocannon on the side just to give our boys a bit of extra firepower when everything's getting a bit frisky in the swamps. I also chucked on some blobs of mud onto the front of the platform as I wanted to add some foliage later and thought this might help it blend in and look all gnarly and swampy. Then I just had the most fiddly details of the build left, which were some reins I'd made by flattening a little skinny sausage of green stuff. I tried out some wire reins on the Squig Rider prototype I'd done a while ago and didn't really like how they looked, so I tested out this method instead, which gave me a much more satisfying strappy appearance. And I liked them so much that I added some strappy bits around the autocannon too, to make it look like it's actually being held on by something. I slopped a bunch more mud onto my base, which I know isn't the right size and shape for field ordnance batteries. I do actually have a spare 100mm round base laying around, but this one's the same as the one I used for the mollusk bombast, so I just thought, it will have some consistency in our inconsistencies. And yeah, the malleus marshcrawla build was now completed, a relatively simple one all things considered, but definitely one of the most unique units in the army build so far. And as always, I was very excited to paint it up. I thought I'd make a start with the sections around the firing platform, going for our signature Swamperial Guard purple colour first. There wasn't a ton of purple areas on this build really, mainly just some bits around the rocket pods and the usual pieces of armour on our green boys. So after base coating those, I moved on to the wooden areas, which I hit with a kind of mid-brown colour, and the muddy areas, which I hit with a much darker brown colour. I hit all the metallic details next using a regular old dark steel colour on the pieces of weaponry, the cage structure on the bottom side of the platform, and the shackle things on the sloggoth itself, followed by a small touch of gold on the casings in the autocannon magazine for a nice little pop of contrast. Those were the main bulky base coats, so once they were out of the way, I also touched in the remaining smaller ones like the fatigues on our soldiers, which were an absolute pain in the nutsack, trying to reach all the little tricky spots, and then all the reins and straps and whatnot, which were a lot easier in comparison. I decided to leave the green boy flesh until the end as I didn't want to dirty it all up with the streak and grime I'd be adding in a moment. And to get everything ready for that grime, I gave the metallic and wooden areas a splash of dark wash to build up some shade and definition that was easier than your mum after 3 cans of Stella and half a Lamdonna, then gave everything some rapid scratchy highlights that would help to maintain a bit of colour variation through the layer of grime. It was then time for the grime itself, and I'm using the dark green one again today as I really like the coloured hues it built up in the Chimera Kitbashed we did last time. I think for this build it didn't have as much of a positive effect as there's a lot less surface area on most of the individual little sections, but it still looked a lot more fitting for a swamp environment than it did before the grimification. And I even added some onto the uniforms of our green boys this time, as sometimes they end up looking a bit too bright compared to the gnarly looking vehicles. In keeping with my usual process for these units, I followed the streak and grime up with some dirty down rust to ensure that any metal bits were looking properly enshittified, and I didn't add it to this build, but I've been playing around with some homemade corrosion texture paste that I'll be incorporating into our future vehicles to pump up this rust effect even further, so you'll probably see that in the next build or two, but I was liking how the firing platform looked at this point. So it was time to move on to the sloggoth itself, which was probably the part of the build I was most excited to paint, as it's always enjoyable painting things in this army that are a bit different to our normal order of business. And I decided to go for a kind of putrid flesh look on him by first using some fairly typical fleshy colours, then following them up with a nice greeny undead flesh colour too. I stippled on this undead flesh colour using a manky old brush that's already got a nice battered up tip, as I wanted to be able to see a mixture of the previous fleshy layers beneath it still. And when I was happy with how that looked, I started glazing in a slightly rancid red colour. I think this paint's called Crusted Sore, which is also what my parents used to call me when I was a child. And I'm not really a pro with this technique, my placement's definitely a bit funky in certain areas, but it's something I've been trying out a bit more recently to kind of broaden my painting horizon slightly, and I think it worked fairly well to make this guy look all sore and gross, but what do you guys think? The flesh was pretty much 90% of the painting on the sloggoth, as he's basically just a large naked goblin mole rat thing. So after I'd finished that, I just added some really rough and ready highlights to the loincloth and strappy bits to help them stand out, then touched in the teeth and tusks around the body with some various bony colours, and also did my best to add some spooky looking eyeballs. I have a special talent for painting eyes on miniatures where one of them usually comes out looking kind of close to okay, and the other one looks like a bird shit splattered onto a dinner plate. But enough about my extreme painting prowess, it was back to the green boys now to paint in their flesh, which is usually my favourite part of these videos, but was anything but that in this case. I mean, it's always good to experiment and try new things, as that's how we learn best, but gluing the minis down before painting them was definitely a big mistake. I may have saved a fraction of my usual painting time, as I couldn't try to perfect areas of paint that weren't going to be visible when the miniatures were added, but that insignificant amount of save time was greatly outweighed by the straight up pain in the butthole annoyance I had in trying to slip down paint into the areas that were still visible but now very hard to reach because of all the other little details around them. It's safe to say this is not something I'll be doing in the future, but I do feel like these guys are a bit more blended in with the vehicle than they usually are, at least, so it's not all bad, I guess. Blatantly obvious painting revelations aside though, I finished everything else off by just giving the paint a general touch up and some quick highlights and extra pizzazz to any areas that were lacking, then got to work on our usual little basing scheme. Again, this was the same old, just going for our bog standard swampy army bases, but I do want to start adding a bit of variety to these in the future as well. I'm thinking of maybe giving each of the subclans a slightly different basing scheme to reflect the different areas of the wide swamplands they come from, but I don't want to mix things up to the point where the army starts to feel cluttered or a bit hectic, so I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that and see whether you think we should incorporate some more thematic subclan bases or just focus on adding some smaller changes to our typical scheme, maybe mixing it up with more mushrooms, logs or reeds and other swampy stuff like that. The final touch as always is to add a small variety of swampy foliage to the base. I added some dark grass stuff to this one today in addition to the usual dun canes and leafy shrub stuff, and I added some of that leafy shrubbery draping down from the front of the firing platform too, as an extra little bit of camouflage and source of fibre for our green boys. Quick rim job with the Steel Legion drab, and we are ready to see how this turned out. So there we have it, my friends, the next happy little addition to the army. And I just realized I don't actually have a name for our weaponized swamp creature subclan yet, so I'm welcoming any suggestions in the comment section below. If someone picks a really good name, I'll probably name it in their honor, and if somebody picks a really bad name, I will fart into a jar and post it to them. But yeah, all in all, this was a really fun little build as always, and I'm quite happy with how it came out, as this sloggoth is quite a menacing looking fella and will inject a good bit of ferocity into our forces, regardless of how ineffective the malleus rocket launcher actually is, although the new codex is coming soon and we might see it become a bit more useful. Who knows? If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment. Let me know how much you love sloggoths and how many marbles you can fit up your nostril. And as always, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.